I wonder if, as we were reading about Jesus going home and not being welcomed by his family, if any of you could relate to that. Going to the most familiar place you know, which should be the safest place you've ever experienced, becomes not good, unsafe. You become the outcast of the family just by your presence, sticking your proverbial dirty tennis shoe in your mouth, bucking the status quo, making people feel uncomfortable. I say it like I know, and you're probably not surprised. If you're the oldest in your family, you may know this. If you're an out-of-the-box thinker, you may know this. If you're a queer person who grew up in West Michigan, you may know this. We challenge what's acceptable, even biblical norms. It occurs in each of our stories today, and one that we didn't read, David the shepherd boy becomes king. And interesting, he doesn't remember where he came from because he immediately uses his power to take over a city and call it his city. In the case of Paul, which is the epistle reading for today, Paul, touted as the greatest missionary ever known, started out as a murderer. He went after the Jews who were following Jesus because they were blaspheming. He couldn't even then, when he had his conversion experience, go back to the Jews because they were afraid of him. He had to go to the Gentiles. And then lived with a thorn in the flesh. We aren't quite sure what that was. Moses was a stutterer who needed his brother Aaron to speak for him. Scripture's full of stories of these kind of unexpected heroes who shined in spite of their hurts and frustrations and foibles and status. Jesus, you hear in this text, he's called a construction worker. Carpenter kind of makes it sound pretty, right? He built crosses for the Romans. He was among the underbelly. Not to mention, he's called his mother's son, not his father's son. That would have been appropriate. That would have given him standing, but no, he's a bastard. He's known by his mother, not his father. Who are the leaders today who come from the underbelly, from the underside of society, who lead the way? Now, I'm guessing we're cohorts here in terms of age. You know about that deaf, dumb, and blind kid. No, I'm not talking about the pinball wizard. Helen Keller, right? Created all kinds of difficulties for the family into which she was born. Difficult to discipline, difficult to teach, difficult to get along with. And yet, she learned to communicate, even to speak. She graduated from Radcliffe, which is now Harvard University. She co-founded the ACLU. She was a proponent, an early supporter of the NAACP, an early proponent of birth control, workers' rights advocate. She wrote 14 books and 475 speeches. One of her greatest quotes is, "The highest result of education is tolerance." Look at how, in spite of, or maybe because of, her vulnerabilities, she was able to shine a light in the darkness. LeBron James has been in the news recently. He's going to sit on the he's going to have a position on the Lakers team again, even though he went free agent, because his son Bronny was recruited, right? First time in NBA history that a father-son duo will play together. LeBron is touted as an NBA player on par with Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, one of the highest paid, highest honored basketball players in history. But here's what I'd like to highlight about LeBron. He's had few controversies in his 20-year tenure as an NBA player. He's used his influence to better his community and taken stands on human rights issues, including women's reproductive rights and workers' rights. In Akron, Ohio, the proceeds from his family foundation built a shopping complex, a housing complex, a medical center, a nonprofit I Promise Institute at the University of Akron, and kept an elementary school open in his community. All of that, in spite of being the child of a single mom who grew up in the heart of Akron and actually was given to another family to raise. Look at what James is able to do, in spite of his vulnerability. When you think of the environmental crisis, we're of an age that we might think about Rachel Carson. But who else comes to mind? A youngster, right? Greta Thunberg, who said, "Why should I go to school when the planet is burning? The planet's not going to be here anymore by the time I'm done with high school." And she went out in front, led the charge as a young person. As a young person with a disability, I might add. Think of the movement she began, the worldwide influence this young person has had. Speaking of young people, I'll claim Anna Bladel and M. Jade Kaiser. You've seen their names in your program before from Enfleshed, two young queer people who are writing fabulous liturgy. It is where your call to worship comes from today, based on these texts. It's brilliant. And their thinking is so progressive and so forward. I thought I was progressive. They're brilliant. Imagine if Jesus came back as a drag queen. Right? It's ridiculous. Would we even bother to listen? Could we hear good news from her? What if we actually listened to sex workers about what they've learned about community policing, community safety outside of policing? What if we actually listened to what indigenous people know about the lands on which we live? What if the leadership in the unhoused, in under-resourced neighborhoods were respected and brought to the table so that their wisdom could inform how we transform conditions in our cities? What if we welcomed refugees instead of building more walls as teachers on how to survive in impossible conditions? What if we apprenticed ourselves to endangered species? What if we took a lesson from the trees? Dan and I just finished, we're almost done with listening to Overstory, the book by Richard Powers, on the way back and forth. Brilliant, brilliant story that teaches us about the millions of years the trees have been surviving in spite of what happens in the climate, in spite of the changes. They teach us about resilience, lasting, surviving. They teach us about how death nurtures life in the forest. They continue to breathe so that we can breathe in spite of what we are doing to them. And if we look, we learn what resilience and grace and reciprocity and beauty look like. Prophets are often described as people who call us to our best selves, and often disregarded in their own places because they critique the foundations of the systems that make the place what it is. And their neighbors are often committed at some level to maintaining those systems in order to prevent disruptions in their own lives. Let me say that again a little bit differently. Their neighbors, we, are often committed at some level to maintaining those systems, even when they're harming or killing us, in order to prevent disruptions to our lives. Fascinating, isn't it? Those who have the most insight into deadly ignorance are often those who have been most subjected to it and dismissed and degraded by it, and therefore are among the least likely to be respected and listened to by those entrenched in it. That, by the way, was a quote from my friends Anna Bladel and M. Jade Kaiser. So what if being home in our culture, in this era of history, felt like we didn't belong? What are the ways that when we come home to the dominant systems, we feel rejected? And if we don't, what does that say about who we are? What are the ways? What are the ways that we need to not lend our power to the systems? What are the ways that we're giving the dominant culture our energy and power? Can we risk exposing our soft underbellies and being vulnerable for the sake of our message? This is how it looks the other way. You might remember a journalist with some disabilities, Serge Kovaleski, was mocked by a former president. He's an investigative reporter for the New York Times. Ridiculed because of his appearance, because of how his body works. The powers couldn't handle it. If you can listen to him, then what's my value? Ask wheelchair users today how easy or difficult it is for them to find their way. In the spiritual community, Shambhala Buddhism, they're taught that, quote, surfacing vulnerability is the path to creating a more fair and just society. Surfacing vulnerability. To the extent that we can let our vulnerabilities show, we create a community of reciprocity, where one gives and the other takes, and that same one gives and the other takes. Each feels validated, affirmed, loved, worthwhile, just as they are. There's no fix needed. We accept people for their God-given, image-bearing character. Each person has something to offer, and each person has something to receive. I think vulnerability needs a remake. There's a Chinese proverb that goes something like this. A farmer and his son had a beloved stallion who helped the family earn a living. One day the horse ran away, and the neighbors exclaimed, "Your horse ran away, what terrible luck!" The farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see. A few days later, the horse returned leading a few wild mares back to the farm as well. The neighbors shouted, "Your horse has returned and brought several horses home with him. What great luck!" The farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." Later that week, the farmer's son was trying to break one of the mares, and she threw him to the ground, breaking his leg. You can imagine what the villagers cried. "Your son broke his leg. What terrible luck!" The farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." A few weeks later, soldiers from the National Army marched through town, recruiting all the able-bodied boys for the army. They did not take the farmer's son, still recovering from his injury. His friend shouted, "Your boy is spared. What tremendous luck!" To which the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." Amen.